Good evening, everyone. I'm Rehana Thowfeek, and I'd like to welcome you to the first chat of AdvoChats. This is a recurring live series of discussions that AdvoCata has initiated. The design of the program is meant to, discuss current economic conversations, which we can tackle in a way that suits a very diverse AdvoCata audience. At times like this, we want to encourage you to initiate conversations and ask questions and take part in these much needed discussions. So in that effect, we'll be taking in questions from the audience. If you will just look at the bottom right of your screen, you will notice a question mark chat box. So you can send in your questions over there. Alternatively, if you don't have access to that, you can always send us the questions on the comment section. So in today's session, Economic Reforms, the Need of the Hour, we'll be discussing the need for economic reforms in Sri Lanka in the present climate, and obviously the urgency of such reforms. So today we have joining with us Daniel Alphonsus. Daniel was an advisor to Sri Lanka's finance minister. He worked previously at the Foreign Ministry and at Verite Research. He read philosophy, politics, and economics at Balliol College, Oxford, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School, where he was a Fulbright scholar. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. So I guess to set the stage, I guess just if we could. I guess I can ask you the first question. It would be, what does economic reform really mean?
Well, that's a very broad question. Let's narrow it down to the Sri Lankan context. What does reform mean? It basically means doing the changes necessary to address the crisis that we're in, and to, in a sort of longer term, put Sri Lanka onto a path back onto the path of prosperity that it embarked on basically in 1977.
Okay. So just a reminder to the audience, please submit your questions to the question chat box or the comment section. So we really want you to get involved in the conversation. So yes, please do that. All right. So the next question, I guess, is, in your opinion, what do you think are the top 3 economic reforms that are most urgent and crucially needed in Sri Lanka at the present context?
So in the current context, I think the first one is the most sort of pregnant issue, which is the issue of debt. And Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio is now in excess of 110%. As a share, sort of interest payments as a share of government revenue are over 70+%. So this is clearly unsustainable debt. Sri Lanka has reached a position for the first time in its post-independence history where it is insolvent, where just and the usual IMF program of giving Rehana, did that come across?
Power cut, yes. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes, the much dreaded power cut.
No problem. So we have a solvency problem for the first time in our history, and that means something needs to give way. And what we need to do, I think, at this juncture is we can't keep kicking the can down the road. We're almost certainly going to face a default at some point. The question is whether it's in 6 months, 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years. That's sort of the question. But if you accept the proposition that Sri Lanka is going to default, then I would submit that it makes sense to default sooner rather than later. And the reason for that is threefold. First is you don't have to go through the suffering that currently people are going through at the moment of scarce commodities, the uncertainty, the chaos that actually is currently there, and you can begin the recovery process sooner rather than later. Because if you're going to have to do those same measures 2 years from now, you might as well start it today. That's the first point. The second point is you can also plan for that process a little bit better. If you are in control of the calendar of when these things take place, you can get advice in advance. The default can be a more managed process. And linked to that is also the question of resources. We still have some reserves. You don't want to default at a point when you have zero reserves, and then you have all kinds of the problems you face when you default are just exacerbated when you don't have that. So that's the first point in terms of reforms. I think we should probably go for a default, at least very, very seriously consider that as an option. The second is almost every country that has had convergence growth. That means growth levels that take you from third world to first. So I'm thinking of the Japans, the Koreas, the Taiwans of this world, has done so on the basis of manufacturing exports. If you look at Sri Lanka's own growth, the point at which Sri Lanka's own growth took off, which was in 1977, coincides also with a growth in manufacturing exports. And because they have this tendency to improve productivity. Once you get on that path, you just seem to keep improving productivity within that. And in order to do that, there's a lot of things that need to take place. But one thing that is absolutely fundamental is tariffs. Right now, it's simply very expensive to produce anything in Sri Lanka. And there are, one of the most important reasons for that is tariffs. The cost of building materials, the cost of raw materials, the cost of any inputs, including labor, is all significantly affected by the very high levels of tariffs that make it, Sri Lanka is one of the most protected countries in the world in terms of tariff protection. So I would say that's a secondary, and that's something AdvoChats has, of course, highlighted extensively over the years. And then it's a tough choice to pick three. But if I had to pick one, I think the other major area I would probably argue is land. Land is a very important factor, and land has a direct relationship to agriculture. And if you look at land allocation in Sri Lanka, a huge amount of land is owned by the state. And when citizens and companies have access to that land, it is on the basis of limited tenure with limited rights. So there's two broad types of non-freehold land tenure that exist. The first is permit land. So I don't know if it's a majority, but a very, very significant number of people who engage in agriculture do not own the land they cultivate. They have rights to it by virtue of a permit. Now, by translating that permit into freehold land, it'll give people the incentive to actually develop that land, and will also allow them to have collateral to invest in it as well. So that's one, permit land. The second type of land where the state has provided limited lease tenures is in the plantation sector. So as you know, that has been the backbone of the economy for many years, now been supplanted by the garment sector and services more generally, but it's still a very, very important sector. And there again, we see that our agricultural yields are considerably lower compared to competitors. In other words, our productivity is lower. And one important reason for that is the incentive structure for the plantation companies. Replanting, one of the reasons why replanting doesn't take place is because of the tenure. It takes 7 years or 8 years to grow a tea bush, but the lease terms are about 30 years. It varies from plant RPC to RPC. Now, what I submit is that in Sri Lanka's case, we need to take a very serious look at this land tenure in the plantation sector. On the one hand, because of on productivity grounds, we could probably get significantly more bang for buck from that land. And secondly, on welfare grounds. If you look at the plantation community in Sri Lanka, they are the only community of the 4 major communities in this country that don't have significant landholding. If you look at all the other communities, 70 to 80% of people own the land they live on. However, in the case of the plantation community, it's about 30%. So there's clearly some significant degree of injustice that's taking place there as well. So I think those two problems could be linked together, and that would really help solve some of Sri Lanka's very serious poverty issues, hidden poverty issues.
Thanks, Daniel. So in the first priority, you mentioned the debt situation and the need to restructure. Do you think it's a possibility to do that without IMF, to credibly do that without the IMF intervention?
So Sri Lanka's default, should it come to pass, is going to be very complex. It's going to be very complex for a number of reasons. First, it's the first time Sri Lanka is defaulting. So we don't really have the institutional knowledge, the expertise on how to manage that. That's one reason. The second reason is because of the structure of the debt contracts. So the bond contracts have changed over time. And they have these things called collective action agreements, which basically mean what share of the bondholders need to agree on a settlement for it to be binding on all the bondholders. And we have some of the older generation ones that make it a little bit more harder to come to agreements. And that's when you have things like what happened in Argentina, where an Argentine warship was seized in Ghana and all kinds of messy things like that. So the structure of the contracts. Then the third issue you have is the fact that the bondholders themselves, that there is some complexity there. So some of the bonds are held by the Sri Lankan government effectively, like Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank and so on and so forth. And then the government de facto exercises influence over some of the other banks too, by virtue of shareholding through the EPF, Sri Lanka Insurance and so on and so forth. So in this situation, and then the law itself, you might have jurisdictional issues. Which jurisdiction do you fight these cases in? So this is really for the lawyers, but what I'm trying to say here is it's a very messy situation, and I don't think it's one that will be resolved very quickly.
Okay. We have an audience question. Hold on. I just like to encourage people to send the questions into the question box. Then it's easier to access it. Okay, let's see. There's one question: how much blame can be directed at our money printing central bank for creating regular inflationary pressure and currency depreciation? If so, how can the central bank be reformed to prevent this?
So I don't think it's fair to direct this to the officials of the central bank at the very least, because with the failure to enact the monetary law parliament, the central bank's independence was knocked. Secondly, the 20th Amendment reached the independence of all public sector officials. And therefore, it's clear that the direction comes from the political authorities, which in this country is the Cabinet of Ministers, who should bear responsibility for the money printing that took place. Now, the question is, why has this money printing taken place? And the reason is that the government's revenues have taken a massive hit, and expenditure has not been. Lanka, contrary to what many people think, is a low tax, low spend economy. So our taxation levels aren't particularly high, neither are our expenditure levels. So what we need to do is we need to increase both. And of course, within the government expenditure, there's huge inefficiencies and huge misallocations. And those need to be addressed as well, and we can discuss those in further detail. But to answer the question of whether, I certainly don't think the officials of the bank should be blamed. I think it's something that should squarely fall with the Cabinet of Ministers.
I guess that brings me to one question: whether it's possible to actually dichotomize economic reforms from, say, other forms of reform like political, constitutional, and other social reforms, because you touched on that point and you said, it's not the central bank officials, it's the policy, it's the, it's the political landscape that's shaping this.
Yeah, I think that's very much ultimately almost any major economic decision involves a political decision, in the sense that there are different people on whom costs are imposed. Let's take what is broadly considered one of the most technical areas of economics, which is interest rates. This has a direct effect, a direct distributional effect, because those for whom who are in debt, unexpected inflation can actually be quite beneficial, while for savers, inflation is very detrimental. So I think, yes, most economic questions are intimately tied with questions of politics, questions of distribution, questions of power.
Thanks, Daniel. We have another audience question. Do you think the socialist policies like free education and healthcare and other socialist policies are a negative factor for the economy? And are those policies a reason for the current situation?
No, I certainly don't think that. I think Sri Lanka's investment in education has served it broadly very well. I think there's issues of efficiency in terms of expenditure. In more recent years, our expenditure, as in public expenditure on education and healthcare relative to our peers, has been lower, which is a cause for concern. And like, there's a sort of standard textbook argument for this, which I think works pretty well. And that is, in the absence of state allocation or state expenditure on this, we will be spending insufficient amounts on education and healthcare. In other words, obviously there will be private expenditure on healthcare and education, but it won't be the optimal level because of the public goods nature. And what's meant by public goods nature of this is the net social benefit of spending a rupee on education is greater than the benefit that the private person would receive, or a citizen would receive, if they themselves spent that rupee. So therefore, the government has a greater incentive to spend that money than a citizen. And so I very much think that education has been, in terms of historically, not so much the last 10 or 20 years, one of the success stories for Sri Lanka. How that, again, has been allocated, I think there's been some inefficiencies in terms of how the distribution of subjects. If you take, for example, at university, we have a very large number of arts graduates and very few in the sciences, relatively, and at A-levels as well. Until quite recently, there was a very, very limited number of schools where one could do sciences A-levels, and that's fortunately been improving. But those are very serious issues in education. Healthcare, of course, I don't know very much about at all, other than Sri Lanka has, from what I understand, a very efficient healthcare system, unlike in the education sector.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with you. But I think, leaving education and healthcare aside, those are not things that we should change, or at least not change in terms of whether the state should provide it. But I think the role of the state as such a big employer in the country needs a bit of questioning. Don't you think so?
Absolutely. So if you look at employment, just look at the numbers. It took nearly 40 years for Sri Lanka to double the number of public servants up until, I think it was around 2005. Then between 2005 and 2015, it nearly doubled the public sector again. So there's a huge expansion. And it's not like the population expanded that much in that period. This was essentially a form of welfare provided to people. And I have no objections to providing welfare to people. I just think this is a terribly inefficient way of providing welfare, because it also means that you take people out of the labor force. And one instance of this is the armed forces following the end of the war. We have around over 280,000 men in the armed forces. If you take a comparison, the UK, which is a much, much larger country in terms of population, I think it's nearly 3 times bigger then Sri Lanka, has under 90,000 now, I think, soldiers in the army, even though they have much greater defense commitments. And a significant part of that is, and it's not like they are linked to any specific national security threats that Sri Lanka faces. Sri Lanka does not face conventional threats that require large infantry battalions. We've settled all our disputes with India in the 60s, Kachatiwa and all of that. So there's no sort of flare-ups on the border. So there's really no need for this large infantry force. And certainly no need for such a large infantry force. So what almost every country has is about 60% of their soldiers in active duty and about 40% in the reserves. Sri Lanka effectively doesn't have a reserves rate. They have what's called the volunteer force, but the volunteer force works full-time. And this is something that is a very serious problem, because many of our most talented and able-bodied citizens are in the army, where they're not contributing productively to the economy or to national security, because they aren't corresponding to the national security threats that we face. And as a result, we don't have the capital expenditure to invest in the modernization of the military, intelligence, diplomacy, etc., which are actually the issues that we face.
And when our sort of labor is sort of trapped in unproductive work, like you said the armed forces, we are actually taking it away from certain private sector industries that actually need a lot of labor. Like at least before COVID, the tourism industry needed, like they had a shortage of workers, and even the construction sector. So I think, yeah, we need to think that's one reform that needs to, be thought of quite seriously. Let's take another question from the question box. Can you see it on the screen, Daniel?
I'm afraid I can't. Do you mind?
Okay, it says, yeah, sure. In terms of an eventual post-COVID recovery, is there a lesson to draw from America's New Deal?
I'm afraid I don't know very much about America, so I can't comment on America.
Okay. All right, let's go to another question then. All right, there's one more question. Is Sri Lanka missing its chance to get into manufacturing exports due to its aging population?
This is a very interesting, and it's a question that worries me quite a lot, because if manufacturing exports are this sort of really important step in converging with the first world, it's much harder when you have an aging population, because people are less dexterous, their ability to learn is harder. So I haven't looked at the research on this, but it is something that I do worry about, and I don't have a good answer. But I think it's certainly a very important question, and one people should be thinking about quite seriously. Yeah, it's definitely a cause for worry. And in that context, I'd like to add two things. Coming back to our conversation on labor, it makes releasing that labor into the labor market, the labor that's currently in the state sector, all the more important. And it also makes releasing another sector that's sort of captive, which is the females of this country. Female labor force participation is very, very low relative to our peers in the region, and certainly relative to Southeast Asia and other converging economies. So that's something that I think the state has a very significant role to play, and we can talk about how the state might do that, but also society in general. So I think we need to think about how we can get female labor force, improve female labor force participation. I'd like to make one point on that, if I may digress slightly, which is a lot of effort in terms of female labor force participation is put onto improving, for example, changing the labor laws, making it easier for people to travel to work. These are all very, very important, undoubtedly. But if you look at what really, I think, plays an even more important role in driving female labor force participation, it is the existence of industries that tend to hire women. One of the reasons why Sri Lanka's female labor force participation rate isn't even worse than it is because of the large amount of the apparel sector that we've developed, primarily through FDI. So I think having that sort of light manufacturing and moving up the value chain, like in Southeast Asia, where people started off, and Japan, where industry started off in apparel, but then very quickly moved up the manufacturing value chain, that's going to be very, very important for that as well. So it's a kind of, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. The female labor force participation, I think that's one area that remains untapped, and that's, we're talking about a potential workforce of about 5 million people. And on the aging population, something I learned recently was that actually post 2000, there was sort of an increase in the number of children born. So actually there's, whereas we earlier thought that, all the, by 2030, it will be mainly sort of older people or over 40s. There's actually a small cohort of younger people who are sort of entering the workforce. So it's a matter of whether we have the right sort of environment and the right sort of policies to actually engage them into the workforce. Let's go to another question. How long could a debt restructuring process take given the Sri Lankan complexities? Could we restructure only a part of this? Example, only the ISBs, for example.
I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that you have a vast range of how long it takes. Like some I think have happened within a year or two. Some have taken years. And then in some cases, like I think this is of course an exception, but it's a fun fact. The USSR, so the Russian, after the October Revolution in 1917, the USSR didn't take on Imperial Russia's debts. And I think they were only settled somewhere in the 90s. So that was 80 years later or something.
Okay. We already covered that question. Sri Lanka already faces labor shortages. Our active migrant worker policy also means that many of our most productive workers are working abroad. Should we adopt a more open immigration policy to attract younger workers to migrate to Sri Lanka for work?
Yeah, so I think on immigration, the question is, I don't think we can take a homogeneous policy. And now this is me not thinking sort of in terms of the welfare of the world, but the welfare of Sri Lanka. I think there we need to make a distinction in skilled and unskilled labor. I don't think we should be importing unskilled labor. We should be allowing the price of labor to rise, and therefore of unskilled labor to rise, and therefore for our citizens to enjoy better standards of living. Now, on the export competitiveness side, you might argue that having higher labor costs is going to disincentivize investors and disincentivize domestic investors from moving into the export sector. Yes, but I think there's many other things we can do to reduce the costs of production for exporters, which don't involve suppressing wages domestically. On skilled labor, yes, I definitely think we should open it up. We need more skills in this country. We need more skilled people in this country. The IT sector and a number of other sectors are really suffering from the inability to scale. And one of the important reasons why they're unable to scale is because of the lack of talent. And yes, opening up to talent and like simply bringing in competition. If we take in Lanka hospitals brought in a number of Indian surgeons that has provided competitive pressure in the medical market today. And you look at many of our leading hospitals, their standards and the standards of the procedures have been improved by virtue of having Indian doctors working here. And that's one of the more unfortunate things, that experiment was terminated. And if you look at the legal sector, the delays, the quality of service, it's really appalling. Anyone here who's gone to a lawyer or if you're a lawyer who's been to court, will be aware of this. And yeah, just opening things up, I think will really serve Sri Lanka well.
Yes, and I think it will allow sort of a technology transfer, which we are, desperately in need of in several of our sectors. All right. So again, I'd just like to remind the audience to please send in your questions to the question box or the comment section. There's a question on the plantation community. The plantation community is not maintaining their income below poverty line. However, they are at expenditure poverty. How could we improve their situation?
So I think, as I mentioned earlier on this chit chat, I think what's critical is not so much income support, but providing a wealth transfer combined with essentially the land, which will act as a wealth transfer, plus provide them an opportunity to grow their own crops and therefore take control of their own destiny. At the moment, most of the plantation sector is linked to a precarious industry that is effectively dying at the moment, and is linked to the infrastructure provided that there, in essence, a sort of form of captive labor that exists there. So providing land is agency, providing land is a source of wealth transfer, and it's a source of economic empowerment for them and for the country.
Yes. I have a couple of more questions. All right, this is an interesting one. What else does the government have in its arsenal to keep kicking the debt restructure can down the road?
Sorry, the question is, what else does the government have in its...
Yes, what else is in the government's arsenal to keep kicking the can down the road in terms of debt restructuring?
That's it. Well, I suppose there's the port city. You can try and sell some assets a little bit and keep kicking that can. There's the geopolitical card. You could exchange some level of sovereignty for in terms of one's alliances in return for some cash. With this state of sort of depressed demand, maybe you could continue to well, yeah, that's not going to give you dollars. So it's a pretty tough one. It's basically, I think.
I guess we are running out of options. Is the
conclusion. I think you might be able to, because even let's take imports, right? Around 80% of imports are intermediate goods. So there's a limit to which you can sort of suppress consumption. I guess that there is a limit to that. You might be able to suppress it a little bit more, but yeah, we're reaching the end.
Very grim. There's one question on what is the cause of the ongoing food shortages and price increases? I guess that's something that's on everyone's mind.
So I think there's different causes. There isn't a single cause, and that depends on different types of food. Let's take something like a product that's subject to controlled prices, right? And milk powder or something. That is affected by the fact that there are goods where producers are making a loss on supplying that good. And therefore they have very little incentive to supply that. And if you expect prices to increase later, you might hoard. So this whole price control is one thing that's affecting supply. Second is the whole system of licensing of imports, the letters of credit, because there's a shortage of foreign currency, because we haven't depreciated the rupee and allowed it to float, you have this perverse system in place, which makes it difficult to import stuff. So that's another cause. Then I think what's also probably starting to happen is with all this fertilizer business, many farmers have changed their behavior. They're planting less. And remember that this is not only fertilizer, this also applies to weedicides and pesticides. And that's a huge hit to agricultural productivity as well. So you have all of this going on at the same time, and that's probably what's contributing to a significant part of the food prices. And of course, this can all be very easily solved. You just remove all the tariffs, and you'll have the world price. Chicken's cheaper in Singapore. Most groceries are cheaper in Singapore. It's not a difficult problem to solve in that sense. And agriculture only contributes 7% of GDP, so fine, you kick 2% of GDP out or something. But in terms of welfare, people will be much better off, and in the longer term, that will also translate to like lower labor costs and so on and so forth. But let's not go into the details of that.
So I guess this goes back to sort of the state's intervention. They're intervening too much in the market, right? The exchange rate, the food supply. So I guess it goes back to this is where we need the reform, and we need it urgently.
We need reform, and we need
it urgently.
Yes, very urgently.
There's another question. Would modern monetary theory offer an alternative to an economic reform program?
So modern monetary theory, by and large, is predicated on issuing debt in your own currency. So the US is able to consider the prospect or the possibility of shaping its policy based on modern monetary theory. Sri Lanka, since independence, roughly half of its debt has been in foreign currency. Since 2007, half of that foreign currency debt has been commercial debt, as opposed to concessionary debt, which was the case prior to 2007. So the question doesn't really arise in Sri Lanka's case because half of our debt is in foreign currency, and therefore, if you start printing lots and lots of money like we are today, you're going to have a currency crash, and that's going to increase the size of your debt relative to government revenue, because government revenue is in rupees, while debt repayments are in dollars. So yeah, it just doesn't arise.
Yes, actually, Sri Lanka's problem is not a rupee problem; it's a foreign currency problem, right? So the modern monetary theory is not something that's likely to work in Sri Lanka.
Well, I would actually argue there's not even a foreign currency problem. We have a debt problem, and it's because of the debt problem that the way the government's trying to handle it is by pegging the currency, or the managed float, or whatever it's called. But we wouldn't really have a foreign currency problem. We'd have significant currency depreciation, but we wouldn't have this sort of shortage of dollars if you allow the market to operate and for the price of currency to clear.
Right. There's a very interesting question on incentives. How do we incentivize politicians to implement these reforms? As there seems to be some resistance due to their fears that they may lose political support.
This is a very difficult question because, like most countries, you go through an experience and you learn from it. Sri Lanka went through that experience in the 70s, learned from it, and then throughout the 80s and 90s and early 2000s kind of continued from using those lessons. Sri Lanka is quite unusual in the sense that it has also unlearned these lessons. And why that's the case, I don't really have a good answer for. I can't think of any other country which has unlearned the lessons that Sri Lanka sort of picked up with so much difficulty. Like if you think of India, you think of Pakistan, you think of Bangladesh in particular, actually, that also had somewhat similar experiences, they all did not go through this unlearning process that Sri Lanka has gone through. And I don't know why. In terms of incentivizing the state, I think it's because it's a mixture here. I think it's primarily politics, but also the bureaucracy's ideas, and the private sector actually. Everyone seems to be naturally find sort of the policies of the 70s naturally attractive. And I don't know why this is the case. This instinctive, the magnetism of them, and I don't have a good answer.
There's one worrying question. Can we expect a tax reform very soon?
Yes, I should think that we would, because if we are going to default, it's very likely that the creditors will insist on IMF involvement, and at the very least will insist on policies that would involve increasing government revenue. And yes, I would expect in the near term to be fairly significant increases in government revenue, which mean taxes.
Unfortunately.
Yes.
So I guess we'll take one last question before wrapping up this session. How important are certain progressive political reforms as precursors for economic reforms to attract investments into the country?
So this is a tough question because you have examples that make the case for both sides. If you look at China, for example, in the 80s, you see very little political reform. The vast majority of sort of industrial and export growth that took place in China was by state-owned enterprises owned by local governments, because there was insecure property rights, because there was no rule of law. People and the Communist Party had a history of expropriating property. Private businesses did not flourish very much in the 80s. So the Chinese society, state, party evolved this institution of the local government running enterprises, which had some of the virtues of private enterprise combined with the protection of being a government thing. And similarly, you see that with the taxation system. There was a lot of fear of expropriation, so they designed this thing called anonymous bank accounts, which meant that the state withdrew its ability to tax you because it didn't know how much money you had. And you look at Korea, South Korea as well. You see a state which was a police state, which was subject to caprice, where the standard governance stuff didn't happen. On the other hand, all these countries have improved their governance over time as they've become more prosperous. The requirement for those institutions to preserve and to continue prosperity became much more acute. And there are other countries like Singapore where having solid governance, the rule of law, was absolutely vital to their growth journey, to attracting foreign investment and so on and so forth. So I think, and then let's not talk about the US, Germany, which in the late 19th century also went through a similar process of transformation, where political institutions played a very important role in improving and sustaining growth. So in Sri Lanka's case, I think the answer is yeah, there are some very key reforms that need to take place to increase confidence of investors. But I would say, and to prevent us from doing really stupid things like what we've done with debt, that I think has a role in terms of political reforms. But I think a lot of this stuff can actually be done without changing institutions, without changing structures. Whether it's sustainable or not is another question. But I think it's a mix. Yeah. Sorry,
I guess
sorry, very
it's
clear that answer.
That's fine. I guess it's political stability and effective management is something that's going to be key for us to attract foreign investments into the country.
And
right?
I'd like to make one quick point on that, which is violence is very costly. And if you look at Sri Lanka's history, we've had consistent sort of violence. We've had riots through the 50s and 60s. Then you have the first JVP insurrection. You have 83. Then you have the second JVP insurrection, and in between the war starts. You have the war. Then in the soon after the war, you begin to see all this anti-Muslim violence. And this is something that is very serious, and that is fundamentally a political issue that has direct economic ramifications. So that's something where I think people need to think very seriously about how to resolve those issues, and to be aware that that the politics and economics are closely linked in this respect, including in quite intentional ways, like GSP Plus. Where Sri Lanka seems hell-bent on losing it for the second time. And GSP Plus is not only important for the apparel sector. The apparel sector is a mature sector. It's going to be competitive. Yes, we're going to have less exports, apparel exports, than we would otherwise. But the real value of GSP Plus is to help us develop new export industries. Sri Lanka, at independence, had tea, rubber, and coconut. We've added apparel and solid tires, basically in the late 70s and very early 80s. Since then, we haven't added a major manufactured export. So in the last 40 years, we haven't done that. And GSP Plus is one of the few avenues we have that could give us a bit of a leg up by virtue of that concessional access to what is the world's largest market, depending on what measure you use. But yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that was the perfect sort of end to our conversation today. We do have a lot of other questions as well, but unfortunately, we have come to the end of our first AdvoChats. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you, Daniel, for joining and engaging in this conversation. And thank you very much to the audience who shared questions and engaged with us. And we encourage you to, join us in the future as well. Please follow AdvoChats' social media pages. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for future events. Thank you very much. I'm Rehana Thowfeek, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Rehana. Thanks, everyone who asked questions and everyone who listened in. Cheers.
Thank you, Daniel.